unfortunately I can't stay longer. But one of the things I was going to say is, I only joined Strathclyde about a couple of months ago. I was Director of Communications and Director of Fisheries at the Scottish Government before that, so much of this is like history of my career in terms of some of the issues. But I think really 2 points to really draw out, and just have a very much strong agreement with you, I think, is the first, this sort of sense of the importance of a continuity provision is just, it's such a profoundly important point that, as you said, it's strange that it's not been given greater prominence. And perhaps the big distinction between the Brexit debate and the independence debate has been, I'll say this strongly, and I don't really mean it as simplistically as this sounds, but in the independence debate, a continuity provision was legally actually quite straightforward. But in terms of implementing an independence process, would have been very difficult in terms of splitting the assets and organisationally changing things. But the legal provision to basically say anything that in UK law currently says the Secretary of State for the Environment or the Secretary of State delete and put the whatever it would be called in an independent Scotland. So the continuity provision was actually quite straightforward. I think what you're saying, and what is not widely understood, is a continuity provision in terms of Brexit would be an absolute minefield, extremely complicated, and it would bring all of these issues into very sharp relief. That point, which you guys as lawyers will understand very well, is not well understood by policymakers, frankly, let alone by your wider public. But it's the profoundness of that point is really important. The second point, which is as much a suggestion as a comment, is the analysis that you've drawn out seems to me very compelling. It's far clearer than I could possibly put it. But in terms of working through some of the issues, there must be some fantastic case studies that we could maybe develop. I know that saying there might be PhD topics, that might be too long for some of this, but like some master's students next summer.
2 year negotiation period, plus 2 year writing up after that might work.
But I mean, just as a couple of specifics just from my sort of recent past, the SNP, when they came to power in 2007, manifesto commitments about opposition to the common fisheries policy. It was almost a central mantra of that party that the CFP was a dreadful thing for Scottish fishermen. Actually, once they became aware of responsibilities within government, began to work through some of the processes, they no longer are opposed to the common fisheries policy, and it's some time since I did that role, so I'm not in that sense taking any credit for this, but actually they began to make the common fisheries policy really work for Scotland. And it shows, do sort of a case study of what political party getting to grips with an issue actually begin to change its view on the issues. Another example, brilliant case study, the Channel Islands are not covered by EU law, but they are part of the UK and are covered by international rules. Guernsey in particular did a piece of environmental work on its sort of control and management of the sea, the 6 mile limits around Guernsey. In effect, they didn't quite recreate the Habitats Directive within their organisations, but actually it so influenced their thinking about what a good environmental policy, marine environmental policy would be, that they weren't bound by it, but they chose to largely implement it. Great case study on some of the political economy and legal issues that you were saying. And last one, which I'm sure the Scottish Government might be willing to work with you on, is the whole issue of in the common fisheries policy, there's European law, but prior to the much talked about December Fisheries Councils, Europe effectively has to do a deal with Norway and the northern states, the Faroe Islands and Norway, and that in some sense largely replicates some of the issues of the common fisheries policy, even though they're totally separate from it. Effectively, the UK would have to be part of that if Brexit. but there are practical experiences and case studies that could be developed that would inform some of the legal issues which, in terms of the analysis here, entirely rightly and understandably, is looking at things from a what might happen point of view. Well, there are some case studies where we've actually had to grapple with some of those issues. And if I can be of any help to any students or you sort of thinking about some of those case studies, that could be a really useful exercise to do potentially over the next years.
I just you're identifying a number of problems. The Channel Islands and so on how I always think so. I had a Chinese postgraduate some time ago who used to keep asking absolutely correct questions about the Isle of Man and Guernsey and Jersey and so on. I just said, just forget about it. It's complicated, it's not central to what you're doing, but you're quite right, they are fascinating examples of what you should do. Yes, I mean, legally, trying to work out legal continuity is a big issue, because what is EU law? If you ask somebody to identify EU law looking at it in any textbook and so on, actually incredibly hard to do, and you don't get the sense that some of the people talking about this have really thought it through, haven't really identified what it is they want to achieve by something, and then work through what that's going to require. There are, as you say, lots of examples of case studies in particular areas where we can identify what is the current role of EU law, what's it done, how far are things going to carry through. And yes, I think I know that lots of organisations really need to be starting to do that reflecting on what it would mean for them, and hopefully feed that into debate.
Thank you. Thanks. Do you have any other questions? Francesca?
Thank you very much to Colin and Martin for sharing it. I've learned a lot. I have 3 questions, maybe a bit of a comment. I'll try to be quick. The first one seems to me that environmental protection can become more media friendly if you bring trade and economy in. So, and numbers, big numbers, pie charts and so forth. So I wonder whether we have a sense of, for example, how much, and I say environmental related very broadly, environmental related UK trade goes to the EU. So how big of a partner is it, and any goods that have an environmental dimension, be it good or bad? And also, which EU countries export tremendously to the UK, which are our trade friends within the European family? And that can, I think, from a wider public perspective, help us put the thing on the map. Now, I have no idea, but I'm assuming there must be some figures out there. So that's the first question. The first, agriculture and fisheries have been a hot debate in many EU countries. In Italy, my country, agriculture has always been an issue. You have always the farmers with the milk bottles on the streets and blocking Rome and so forth. It's all over the place. Quotas, that kind of policy. Obviously, no time to go into any detail, but if the UK were to have its own agriculture and fishery policy, what would it look like? How do you define a good agriculture or fishery policy? And I know these are massive questions, so I don't need you to go in any detail whatsoever. But I mean, how was it before? And obviously, it's another world and so forth. But how was it before? How would it look like? And the third question is very much what Mark was saying. This can be a rather technical debate, a rather legal debate. How will debates like this be present in the general public? What role will they have, if any, in the final decision for non-environmental law experts, or even for people who are not environmentally minded, and there's still quite a lot out there. So, at some point there will be the B-Day, and somebody will have to take a yes or no decision. How much of this will actually be present in their mind? I think this is, aligns with what Mark was saying at the end. And how do we make it more mainstream without all the pie charts and so forth?
George, coming on the final point.
Yeah, sure.
First, well, maybe it links somewhat to the first point you made about economics. It's trying to portray these issues in a way that does engage people. One area of environmental law which potentially could do that is bathing water. The bathing water is hugely important for tourism in the UK. Many resorts and the hotels in those resorts pride themselves on being in places which meet bathing water quality standards, and there is an economic impact there. So if you can latch onto issues like that, where you may be able to engage people, partly through economics, and partly because there could be a direct impact if controls were deregulated. You'd be swimming amongst unspeakable material if these standards were met. Maybe that's picking on some issues where people potentially could engage a little. But it gets back to the first point you made, that you show that there's actually an economic impact potentially in all of this. So when people are thinking with their heads rather than their hearts about this, in fact, there could be serious economic damage done if there's massive deregulation, and our trade with the EU could be seriously affected.
Just sorry, Aileen, if I jump into that, being the devil's lawyer, it depends on the numbers. I mean, if the UK main future trade relationships with New Zealand and China and Canada on all the technology coming out from research and development, who cares about the EU? And trade doesn't have to be just down the channel. I mean, now we can trade with ideas, with services, and we are a service country to some extent. So that's why I think the numbers are quite important. And that can be a bit of a challenge for those like me who are European, don't want this to happen. But if at least the mantra, the political mantra is, yeah, the EU is important, but actually our trade is with China, with our Commonwealth friends, then maybe the general public will say, well, the EU is not that important.
Well, the Commonwealth friends, especially New Zealand, are now doing the trade with China that we could be doing. They're not trading with us. So I think it ties back to also the third issue. I think food may be a big element. If you go to the supermarket and just think how much of our food, particularly fruit and vegetables, comes from the EU, that's a big issue, and that is affected by EU environmental policies, food standards policy, environmental policy, water policy, and so on. So there are arguments that can be made, whether that's Scottish exports of, particularly Scotland exports of fish, seafood, whisky, and so on. Again, you could make arguments there. But it is vulnerable, the whole thing is vulnerable, because the bathing water example, yes, I mean, we wouldn't say that if we left the EU, we wouldn't revert to say, right, we can shut all the wastewater plants we built and just go back to putting the stuff out. But in 10, 15, 20 years' time, when they come to be upgraded, when money comes to be spent, there wouldn't be the same pressure to spend them. And that's a hard argument. It is a hard argument to make, because you're arguing about what might happen. And all these environmental issues, you're going to be arguing about what might happen almost certainly sometime in the future.
But in a sense, I mean, the pro-exit campaign are using emotional arguments, so I don't see why, in a sense, we don't need to make the point in some ways that, this is all long term. This could happen much sooner, it's possible. So, again, you need to be media savvy, I guess, about how you present these arguments. And you have to try and be quite emotional about them as well as rational, I guess.
I think that possibly, it's not a Scottish example, but the one area which is going to be a pinch point is air quality in London. Heathrow Airport and so on, the government already showed reluctance to comply with its requirement in New York. There is no doubt that if we left the EU, the drive to the EU air quality standard would be pulled back because it's difficult, expensive, and so on. I think that's going to be a big, potentially a big challenge, a big test area for the government, how it sees its engagement with environmental standards from the EU.
I'd like to follow up on one of the trade questions, and that is actually something that wasn't particularly covered, is where the EU is enhancing global standards. So I'm thinking of the forest law enforcement, governance and trade, the voluntary partnership agreements with countries, which is linked with the EU timber regulations to stop the importation of illegal timber from tropical countries. And the EU, with huge push from the United Kingdom and financial support from the UK Department for International Development, has been responsible, along with the Germans in particular, in pushing this in a number of both, in a number of countries in Africa and Asia. And there are two things that concern me. One is that the UK on its own may not necessarily have the kind of scope of convening power. You're talking about numbers. So, importation into the European Union is, again, from the voluntary partnership agreement, is quite a large driver of change for forest governance in many countries. And just sort of importation into the United Kingdom on its own would be like, why bother, really? It's not going to work. So there's that kind of issue. And the second is in relation to those international standards that we've been creating through voluntary partnership agreements, again, would we go backwards in terms of then importing illegal timber into the United Kingdom again from countries when we no longer are part of the EU and part of the voluntary partnership agreement, which is between the European Union and, say, Ghana? If we leave, we are no longer, as far as I would be aware, part of it, and yet we have, or the UK, has been very strong in driving that change in a country like Ghana in particular. So it's a kind of slightly different view. It's both the outward-facing view, and some of that also mirrors some of the work that the EU has done around climate standards, but focusing on that very practical issue seems to me to be kind of a great concern.
Or to put it the other way, to get devil's advocate, we'd now be free from having to go along with the slowest of our European partners, and we could impose our own properly high standards and make sure that we have the best standards in the world as an example for the rest of them. Others may not choose to follow us, but we'd be free. We wouldn't have to make all those compromises. We could do what we really want to do.
Well, that's true up to a point, and yet what is the incentive for a country with which we trade when we would be a very small player vis-a-vis China's importation of timber, America's importation of timber? We become such a small player that we can impose whatever standards we like, but we're likely to then fall foul of WTO regulations, which the BPA at the moment don't do.
There's another question for you. Yes, please.
Hello everyone, I'm a visiting PhD from China. I have a very simple but maybe irrelevant question, but I'm really very interested about this. When I first read your topic, the first question in my mind is that is there any fundamental difference between the topic, the Brexit and the environmental law, and the Brexit of the other subject of the law, for example, human rights law? So can we generalize your topic into the Brexit and the UK legislation or something like that?
Yeah, it's a lot of the stuff.
Fundamental difference.
A lot of the stuff is common. I mean, the structural stuff is common. The fact that we'll be bound whatever area of activity you're involved in, there will be some international obligations that exist with the EU. Why the environmental is interesting, where it's slightly different, is that the nature of the obligations on the member state are a bit different, and the way in which EU provisions are then fed through into such pervasive national legislation. If you were doing something on, if you were a labour lawyer doing stuff on employment law, you could do the same sort of stuff. The first chunk would be the same. The second chunk would be looking at international labour organisation and so on requirements, and then your examples would be how requirements under EU law in relation to working time and so on, the number of hours drivers, lorry drivers can work and so on, had been worked through and been trying to think about the particular context. So it is, you know, it's looking at it from a particular context. The structures are the same, but when you do look at each context, it makes it more understandable, it makes it more manageable, and in different areas there will be slightly different balances, slightly different issues to be talked about.
Actually, I'm going to use chair's privileges here because this ties into the question I wanted to ask you. I think there is a distinction to be made in environmental law, and this goes back to your idea about uncertainty. So Brexit raises a huge amount of uncertainty, but it raises different kinds of uncertainty, some of which I think are more problematic than others. A lot of the uncertainty you talked about was the kind of uncertainty we faced in relation to the independence referendum. It is essentially transitional. We don't know what the transition is going to be like. There'll be lots of complicated legal questions to be sorted out. But equally, when we joined the EU, there were lots of complicated legal questions to be sorted out about exactly how we accommodated EU law, but what impact that would have on our interpretive rules, and so on and so forth. We worked them out over time. If you think the goal is worth doing, then the transitional costs are worth bearing, because that's all they are. And uncertainty is a necessary accompaniment to any kind of change. But I think that the more fundamental and important level of uncertainty that you identified is something that is not necessarily peculiar to environmental law, but is particularly important to environmental law, which is the long-term nature of environmental damage, and therefore the greater need for certainty over the long term as to what the law is. Now, you argued persuasively that EU law for us performs that constraining function on temporary political majorities, something that we don't have in our domestic constitutional culture, because our culture is one of extreme flexibility. Any parliament can do what it likes, completely change the previous government's policy. I suppose my question is, and this picks up on something that Mark said, is to what extent, in the event of Brexit, can we reproduce that certainty function that EU law provides in different ways, perhaps more satisfactory ways? And the point I wanted to pick up on Mark talked about regulatory culture. We wouldn't necessarily want to go back to the regulatory culture of 1972. I think that's equally true of constitutional culture. Our constitutional culture has changed since 1972, partly because of EU law, although not exclusively, and it is, I think, just wrong to think that we withdraw from the EU, we're back in 1972. We're not. You know, so are there alternative ways that we can think of in a domestic arena or through international negotiations of giving ourselves that constraint on temporary majorities? Bearing in mind, of course, that that is in conflict with democracy, flexibility, responsiveness, blah, 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 blah.
Well, in terms of regulatory culture, I think Mark's absolutely right. I mean, we won't go back to a complete discretionary thing. I think the problem comes in the crunch points, where the decisions are difficult, as we've seen in relation. I keep coming back to the fine terms. It's such a good example that, yes, for the everyday run-of-the-mill stuff, we have absolute standards and so on. But when it really got difficult, when it really got expensive, then the government will want to be able to pull back and so on. And to some extent, I think that's the same on the wider stuff. It's not the everyday non-problematic stuff where people are happy enough to go, yes, it's a bit awkward, a bit troublesome, but we'll go along with it. It's where the crunch really comes. And I think that's where I think there'd be the real danger of, there'd be the real change. When you see it in the human rights area on what to me has always been a stupid issue, the prisoners voting. Why anybody gets so upset about this and why they haven't been able to find a fudge that sorts it out, which secondary students can find a way around it, but never mind. That's an example where something has become seen as being a big issue. And when it comes to the push, what the UK, some people in the UK want to do is to break out of the constraint, break out of the framework. And that's, I think, what you would see in some of the areas where it does get expensive, troublesome, is going to require major disruption to the way business as usual goes on. And I don't see a particular willingness to accept limitations on government in other areas. I can't see the environment being the leading example.
Yeah, actually, I agree with you in terms of climate change. My confidence about its ability to bind is taking a severe beating in the last few days.
I mean, I think a major change there would be just a lack of accountability at another level. I mean, I accept, I mean, I think our regulatory culture has changed dramatically since the 1970s. And I think even at governmental level, there's a much greater willingness to accept binding standards. But up to a point, the fact we are members of the EU enables that extra level of accountability so that the UK can be required to comply with things that may take some time and some argument. But that would be missing. And maybe this fits with Colin's idea of hard cases, that this would actually come up, you know, around significant projects like Heathrow, where the government accepted that there were binding standards sometimes. But there might be national interests that also sometimes trumped those standards. And that I think would be the big change. So I would express it. I mean, I agree, I think things have changed very considerably. But what would be absent would be this extra layer of accountability, which could hold governments to long-term goals and targets. And I think that would go, and that would create problems around, I think, nationally significant projects which had a significant environmental impact.
We have to accept that it's a problematic form of integrated.
Yes.
I mean, we
Yes.
can't
Yeah, no,
the
absolutely.
democratic criticisms of the EU, they are valid. And I think the point you made, from Maria Lee's point, you know, if this was a different context, the arguments would be very different, wouldn't they? And it's the same with the ECHR issue. It's reasons why the government wants to reform human rights law to, extend our rights into the social media. Exactly. I would feel very differently when I actually know what they want to do is, take rights away from terrorist suspects or immigrants or foreign soldiers or, that context is everything. But I think we shouldn't allow our view of the politics of the situation to blind us to the fact that there are issues of principle underlying it and principled arguments to be made on both sides. I think that tension between long-term certainty and short-term democratic accountability is a very real one. Can't ignore.
I'm sure there are other people.
Can we
Just a quick question. Point. What you say is quite right. I mean, one has to be careful not to create a debate which is such a dichotomy that, for example, in the environmental perspective, the EU becomes all of a sudden a beacon of sustainability and greenness and of everything that is good is the EU, because that's, in a political perspective and in the media perspective and in the yes or no, it's almost like shooting yourself in the foot. So that's also a risk. Sorry.
Put my cards on the table. I'm not an expert in EU environmental law at all. I'm just here as an interested party in the topic of Brexit, and I'm learning lots, so thank you very much. I'm wondering, Brexit's, let's say, potentially the next step, but there's another kind of potential in between that, in that David Cameron is now trying to renegotiate with other leaders, and today he said in the papers that he's going to try and push that to a December deal so that he can get a summer referendum, which would be a disaster. But if he succeeds in getting a deal, and this includes the notion that the UK is exempt from what is a very broad, ever closer union, because that's one of his key demands, is that the UK would no longer be affiliated to this phrase. Would that potentially have any risk on the UK in terms of implementing environmental law? Because would the EU ever push environmental law so far that the UK could say, well, we have an explicit agreement that we are not involved in ever closer union and this is one step too far for us, therefore we don't want to be part of that? I mean, is there any risk there?
I think there's plenty of scope for argument and debate about where the boundaries are. I mean, where are matters simply trade connected and where are the ones which are starting to interfere with our domestic regulation of our own matters. I suspect the Habitats Directive might be one that would be seen as a target. It was seen as that's not actually, although it initially, well, the Directive initially was punished as a trade issue to some extent, it's not actually, you would be seen as not being central. Now the fact is that we do have the same obligations under the Berne Convention, would raise different arguments, but there'd be, you could see in all sorts of areas there'd be room for argument, although we don't actually need to comply with this because it is part of the ever closer union bit rather than the free trade bit. But that's a boundary you can argue about all the time, because one of the reasons why the gross generalisation, one of the reasons why EU reach has got further over the time is because it was realised that there were actually trade and competitive advantages in not having all sorts of peripheral, in a sense, peripheral issues dealt with, that people were using those as a way of undercutting each other. And so where you draw the boundary between the acceptable free trade, common market type issues, and the unacceptable ever closer union ones, very hard to say. But plenty of scope for argument on it.
And presumably it would only apply to the future, so it wouldn't undercut any existing obligations that we've already signed up to.
Presumably, but
Any other questions? Okay, well I think we can end up there. Thank you very much, Colin. That was an absolutely fascinating discussion. It's really, really good to start to drill down into some of the consequences of Brexit. Thank you very much for introducing us to them so very competently, comprehensively, and entertainingly. So it was great. So could I ask you to join me in thanking both Colin and to Mark for his